Chapter 1. A Cry in the Darkness. The winds howled over the barren plains of Velmara. 7. A planet as harsh and unforgiving as the void of space itself. Once a promising frontier world, its thin atmosphere and unpredictable weather had turned it into a place of suffering and scarcity, where those who lived here had to fight for every breath, every drop of water, and every scrap of medicine. It was not a place for the weak, nor was it a place for the fortunate. It was a place where the desperate clung to life with trembling hands, praying that the next sunrise would not be their last. For Zalera Cathis, every second felt like a battle she was losing. The dim lights of her small, cramped dwelling flickered as she sat beside Sarai, her youngest child, her delicate fingers gently brushing against the small girl's forehead. Burning. Too hot. Zalera swallowed hard, her throat dry, her twin hearts pounding against her ribs, knowing that the fever was worsening. The child's breathing was shallow, weak, and with every passing moment, it grew more labored. Zalera tried to keep her hands steady, but she felt them tremble. The medicine was gone. She had rationed every last dose, stretching it out longer than she should have, hoping, praying that help would arrive before she ran out. But help had not come. The colony's medical shipments had stopped arriving weeks ago, and the off-world traders, those few who dared to land on Velmara, 7, hoarded what little they had, charging prices that no struggling mother could ever afford. She had begged. She had bartered. She had offered everything, her savings, her labor, even her dignity, but it had not been enough. And now, her child was dying. Sarai let out a weak whimper, her small body shivering violently despite the burning heat radiating from her skin. Zalera clenched her teeth, fighting back the sob that threatened to break her, forcing herself to stay calm, to stay strong. A mother could not afford weakness, not when her child needed her. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around Sarai, running a hand over the small girl's delicate, scaled forehead, whispering soft, soothing words in her native tongue. "Stay with me, my love. Just a little longer. Hold on." But even as she said the words, she could feel them cracking like brittle glass under the weight of her despair. There was no more time. If she did not find medicine soon, she would lose her daughter. Desperation surged through her, wild and unrelenting, pushing her past exhaustion, past hopelessness, past fear. She had to try again, had to find someone, anyone who could help. With one last look at Sarai, Zalera rose to her feet, grabbed her tattered cloak, and stepped out into the cold, merciless night. A world of scarcity. Velmara, 7 was dying. It had once been a world of promise, a place where colonists, both human and alien alike, had come seeking a new beginning, a fresh start, away from the bureaucratic grasp of the inner systems. But what they had found was a world that did not care for their dreams, a world that took and took, until there was nothing left to give. The terraforming had failed decades ago, leaving behind a planet that was barely livable, its atmosphere thin, its water scarce, its land cracked and barren. Crops struggled to grow, and the few that did were ravaged by sudden dust storms and violent temperature shifts. What little industry had been built here had collapsed, leaving most of the colony to scrape by on whatever they could scavenge or trade. And then there was the blockade. The trade syndicates, the powerful corporate overlords that controlled interstellar commerce, had deemed Velmara, 7 a failed investment, withdrawing their resources and cutting off most trade routes. Supplies came rarely, and when they did, they were hoarded by the wealthy few, leaving the rest of the colony to fend for themselves. Medicine was the most precious commodity of all. Without regular shipments, diseases that should have been easily treatable became death sentences. And now, Sarai was one of the many who had fallen victim to this brutal reality. Zalera pulled her cloak tighter around herself as she made her way through the crumbling streets of the colony's central settlement, her boots kicking up dust as she walked. The streets were almost empty, save for the occasional figure huddled against a deteriorating building, their eyes hollow with hunger and sickness. She did not stop. She could not afford to. Her destination was the trade quarter, where the few merchants who still operated on Velmara, 7 sold their goods at exorbitant prices, preying on the desperation of the colony's inhabitants. She hated them, but right now, they were her only hope. Bargaining with the heartless. The trade quarter was a maze of rusted stalls and makeshift shops, their metal exteriors covered in grime and soot, their owners watching with sharp, untrusting eyes as desperate colonists approached, hoping to strike a deal. Zalera moved quickly, her heart pounding, searching for the one thing she needed most: medicine. She spotted a merchant she had approached before, a wiry, reptilian man named Vorik, who had long since made it clear that he only cared for profit, not people. His stall was filled with various good spices, tools, small rations of food, but among them, tucked away in a locked case, she saw the small vials of golden liquid that she knew could save her daughter's life. She approached, already knowing what his answer would be, but she had to try. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the desperation clawing at her throat. "My child is sick. She won't survive the night. I need one vial. Just one." Vorik leaned back, his expression bored, his forked tongue flicking out slightly as he studied her. "Ah, Zalera. Again? You already know the price." Her fists clenched. "I have nothing left to give." He sighed, as if deeply inconvenienced. "Then I have nothing to sell you." Zalera's body trembled. "You can't just let her die." Vorik gave her a slow, pitying look. "It's not me who's letting her die, Zalera. It's the universe. It is cruel, yes?" Rage burned in her chest, hot and consuming. But she knew that anger would not save Sarai. She had nothing left to offer. No money. No valuables. Nothing. But before she could speak again, before she could fall to her knees and beg if that was what it took, a new voice cut through the tension. "How much?" Zalera whirled around, her eyes landing on a human, standing just behind her. He was tall, rugged, his features lined with the kind of weathered exhaustion that only came from years of hardship, yet there was something sharp in his gaze, something unyielding. His clothes were worn but sturdy, his stance relaxed but alert, as if he were always prepared for trouble. Vorik raised an eyebrow. "And who might you be?" The human ignored the question, his eyes locked onto the case of medicine. "How much for the vials?" Zalera's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? And why was he trying to help? Vorik smirked, sensing an opportunity. 3,000 credits. Per vial. The human didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small data chip, and tossed it onto the counter. "That should cover all of them." Zalera stared in shock. Vorik blinked, looking down at the chip, then back up at the human, clearly trying to process what had just happened. "You're serious?" The human folded his arms. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Zalera's heart raced as realization dawned. This human had just bought the medicine that would save her child. Chapter 2. The human who would not walk away. Zalera could not breathe. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest, leaving her frozen in place as she stared at the human who had just without hesitation bought enough medicine to save her daughter's life and likely a dozen others. Her entire body was still trembling, her twin hearts pounding so hard she thought she might collapse, but she forced herself to speak. Why? It was all she could manage. One word. One question. The human turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Because I could." His voice was steady, firm, but it was not cold or dismissive. There was something behind it, something deeper, something that spoke of experience, of understanding, of a life that had not been easy. Vorik, the merchant, scoffed as he picked up the credit chip, running a scanner over it with a flick of his wrist. The chip beeped, confirming the transaction. His slitted eyes flicked back toward the human, a mixture of amusement and curiosity in his gaze. "A generous fool. You could have bartered. I might have given you a discount if you had put in the effort." The human did not even glance at him. "Give her the medicine." Vorik smirked but said nothing as he reached into his case, carefully pulling out 3 vials of golden liquid. Zalera could barely process it as he handed them to her, the small glass tubes feeling impossibly fragile in her hands. She clutched them so tightly she feared she might break them, but she couldn't loosen her grip. Sarai would live. Her baby would live. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She turned to the human, staring up at him, searching for some kind of motive, some reason why he had done this, but all she found in his expression was resolve and quiet exhaustion. "I do not know how to repay you." Her voice shook as she spoke, her throat raw from hours of holding back sobs. "I have nothing to give dash." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "You don't owe me anything." The words sent a fresh wave of confusion and disbelief through her. No one did something like this for nothing. No one on Velmara 7 had anything to spare. And yet this Manet human, of all people, had just spent a fortune without blinking. Her people had a saying, "No kindness comes without a price." And yet, "What is your name?" she asked, because she needed to know. The human hesitated for the briefest moment, then said, "Ethan." Ethan. A simple name. A human name. She committed it to memory, knowing she would never forget it for as long as she lived. Ethan exhaled and ran a hand through his dark, slightly unkempt hair. "Go. Get back to your daughter. She needs that medicine more than I need gratitude." Zalera could barely keep herself from falling apart as she turned away, cradling the vials to her chest. She had wasted enough time. She had to get back to Sarai. With one last lingering glance at Ethan, she turned and ran. A mother's desperation. Her feet pounded against the cracked ground as she sprinted through the settlement, weaving through narrow alleys and broken pathways, ignoring the biting wind and the stinging dust in her eyes. The only thing that mattered was Sarai. She reached her home and threw open the door, stumbling inside. The dim lighting flickered, barely illuminating the small, single-room dwelling, where her daughter lay on the makeshift cot, her breathing too slow, too weak. Zalera dropped to her knees beside Sarai, her fingers shaking as she carefully pulled the vial from her pouch. "Sarai, my love, stay with me. Just a little longer." She uncorked the vial, gently lifting the child's small, fragile frame, tilting her head back. She had to be careful too much at once could overwhelm her system. Too little might not be enough. Slowly, she pressed the edge of the vial to Sarai's lips, letting a few golden drops trickle into her mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a slow inhale, and another. The fever began to break almost instantly, Sarai's body relaxing as her ragged breathing evened out. Her small hand, which had been limp and lifeless, curled weakly around Zalera's fingers. Zalera sobbed, pressing her forehead against Sarai's, her relief overwhelming her. Her baby was going to live. She had prayed for a miracle, and somehow, against all odds, a human had answered. The aftermath. She did not sleep that night. Even after Sarai's condition stabilized, even after the medicine had begun its work, Zalera sat beside her daughter, watching her breathe, watching the color return to her delicate features, unable to look away, unable to let go of the fear that had consumed her for days. Her mind kept returning to Ethan. She had never trusted humans. Most of her people did not. They were a species that had spread rapidly across the stars, carving out territory wherever they saw fit, their influence far outweighing their numbers. Some called them pioneers, others conquerors. Some said they were reckless fools, while others whispered that they were the most adaptable, dangerous species in the galaxy. Zalera had always been indifferent to them. Until now. Until one of them had saved her daughter's life. And he had asked for nothing in return. She could not let that go. The next morning, as the first pale rays of Velmara 7's weak sun filtered through the cracks in her home's walls, she made a decision. She would find him, and she would not let him walk away again. Seeking the human, it was not difficult to track him down. Velmara 7 was not a large colony, and humans were rare enough that finding one was not a challenge. By midday, she had located his ship, a well-worn but sturdy freighter parked at the edge of the settlement, its hull scarred by time and travel. She approached cautiously, uncertain of what she would say, uncertain of what she even wanted. The ship's ramp was open, and as she drew closer, she saw Ethan crouched beside a maintenance panel, a tool in hand, muttering curses under his breath as he struggled with some mechanical issue. She hesitated. Then Ethan. He paused, then turned, his expression shifting from mild irritation to surprise. "Zalera?" He straightened, wiping grease from his hands onto his jacket. "What are you doing here? Is your daughter Dash?" "She is alive," Zalera said quickly, stepping forward. "Because of you." Ethan nodded, relief flickering across his features. "Good. That's what matters." She stared at him, searching his expression for any sign that this had not been as effortless for him as he had made it seem. "Why?" she asked again. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone die when you can't do anything to stop it. I couldn't stand by and let that happen to you. Zalera felt something tighten in her chest. She did not have the words to express what she was feeling, but she knew one thing. She could not let this human leave without repaying him in some way. I owe you a debt, Ethan Voss. Her voice was quiet, but firm, one that I will not ignore. His lips quirked into a small, tired smile. Then I guess we're stuck with each other. Chapter 3. A debt that cannot be repaid. Zalera had lived a life dictated by rules, necessity, and survival. On Velmara 7, there was no place for luxuries, no time for pointless gestures. Everything was a trade, a negotiation, a struggle to gain something that might mean the difference between life and death. The idea of a debt unpaid was not just unthinkable, was an insult, a stain on one's honor, a weight that could never be ignored. And yet, as she stood before Ethan Voss, the human who had saved her daughter's life without hesitation, she realized that some debts were impossible to balance. He had simply shrugged off the act as though it meant nothing, as though it was not the most significant moment of her existence, as though he had not reached into the abyss and pulled her child back from the edge of death. And that was something she could not comprehend. He had no obligation to help her. He had no reason to care. And yet he had. For days, she watched him, trying to understand him, to decipher the kind of man who would do such a thing. He spent his time repairing his ship, trading parts with the colony's mechanics, occasionally disappearing to handle some errand that seemed of little importance. He kept mostly to himself, speaking only when necessary, offering no more words than required, but even so, she noticed the way he watched the people around him, the way his gaze lingered on those who struggled, the way his hands never hesitated to help when something needed fixing. Ethan Voss was a man who did not look away from suffering, and Zalera could not look away from him. An unspoken pact. She began to seek him out, at first with caution, then with purpose. One day, she brought him a meal, a simple dish made from the few edible crops that still grew in the colony's struggling hydroponic farms. He had been elbow-deep in engine parts, cursing under his breath at some uncooperative piece of machinery, when she placed the plate beside him and simply walked away. The next day, he returned the favor, leaving a bundle of fresh rations at her doorstep, food she had not been able to afford in months, food that would last her and Sarai for a week. No words were exchanged, but something had shifted between them. She started helping him with his work, bringing tools when he needed them, trading supplies on his behalf, negotiating with the merchants who tried to cheat him simply because he was an outsider. At first, he tried to brush her off, to tell her she didn't need to, but she simply gave him a look that dared him to argue. He didn't argue after that. It became routine. She helped him secure supplies. He helped her reinforce the failing power grid in her home. She brought him information about the traders. He fixed the faulty heating unit in her daughter's room. They did not speak of the debt, did not acknowledge it outright, but it existed in the space between them, a silent understanding that neither of them was willing to break. And for the first time in a long, long time, Zalera did not feel so alone. The shadows that follow. But Velmara 7 was not a place that allowed good things to last. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks after Ethan had saved Sarai. It started with whispers, merchants muttering about new arrivals, ships that bore no insignia, men who asked too many questions. The kind of men who did not come to trade, but to take. Zalera had been in the marketplace when she heard his name spoken by the wrong people. Ethan Voss. The human who had spent a small fortune on medicine. The human who had no business being here. The human who was too generous, too kind, too much of an anomaly to go unnoticed. And in a place like Velmara 7, anomalies were never ignored for long. She rushed to find him, her pulse hammering, her mind racing with possibilities. She found him exactly where she expected, at the outskirts of the colony, working on his ship, oblivious to the fact that danger was closing in. Ethan. He looked up from his work, wiping grease from his hands. What's wrong? She didn't waste time. There are people asking about you. He stilled. Not visibly, not obviously, but she could see it in the way his fingers tightened, just slightly, the way his jaw tensed. What kind of people? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. The kind who don't come looking unless they already know what they're looking for. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, that tracks. Zalera narrowed her eyes. You were expecting this? He shrugged. Not expecting. Just prepared for the possibility. That was not an answer. Not a real one. She crossed her arms. Who are they, Ethan? He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. Trouble. Her frill twitched in irritation. That is not an answer. He gave her a tired, knowing look, one that told her he was not used to explaining himself to anyone. You don't want to get involved in this. She stepped forward, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that there was no space left for him to retreat. You saved my daughter's life. Her voice was quiet, but steady. That means you are involved in mine, whether you like it or not. Ethan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, finally, he sighed. There's a bounty on my head. The words landed like a stone in her chest. She had suspected as much. No one carried themselves the way he did without having a past that followed them, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Who? She asked. Ethan rubbed his temples, clearly not wanting to have this conversation. A lot of people. I've made some enemies over the years. And now they've found you. He nodded. Looks like it. Zalera felt a sharp, protective instinct surge through her, an emotion she had not expected. Ethan had saved her daughter. She would not let him die for it. A choice made in the dark. That night, Zalera did not sleep. She had spent years learning how to survive, learning how to navigate the brutal reality of Velmara. 7. And she knew one thing for certain: if Ethan stayed, he would not live to see another sunrise. The bounty hunters would find him, and they would not care that he was a good man. She could not allow that to happen. When dawn broke, she went to him, standing at the base of his ship's ramp, waiting for him to emerge. He did, looking worn, but unsurprised to see her there. You have to leave, she said. He sighed. I know. She swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I do not like unpaid debts, Ethan Voss. His lips quirked into a small, tired smile. Then consider us even. She shook her head. No, we are not. She reached into her coat, pulling out a small, data-encrypted device. She pressed it into his hand before he could protest. Coordinates, she said simply. If you ever need a place to run. For the first time, he looked genuinely taken aback. Then, slowly, he closed his fingers around the device. I'll remember. And with that, Ethan Voss stepped onto his ship, and Zalera watched as he disappeared into the stars. She would see him again. She was certain of it. Chapter 4. A Debt Paid in Full. Velmara, 7 was never truly quiet. Even in the dead of night, the winds howled across the barren plains, rattling the fragile structures that made up the settlement. The people of the colony had learned to live with the ever-present noise, just as they had learned to live with scarcity, with suffering, with the unrelenting weight of a world that had long since stopped caring for its inhabitants. But on this night, Zalera stood at the edge of the landing fields, listening not to the wind, but to the absence of something else. Ethan was gone. His ship had disappeared into the sky hours ago, vanishing into the cold darkness of space, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of ionized air and the ghost of something she could not name. She had known, from the moment she had given him the coordinates, that he would not stay. He was a man marked by the past, a man who did not belong in one place for long, and Velmara, 7 had never been anything more than a temporary refuge in the middle of his running. And yet, the weight in her chest did not ease. She had not expected to feel anything when he left. She had been prepared for gratitude, for relief, for satisfaction in knowing she had repaid what was owed. But none of those emotions came. Instead, she felt something far more dangerous. She felt his absence, and she hated it. The cost of survival. The days passed slowly, quietly. The traders came and went, the markets remained ruthless, and the colony continued its slow decay. Zalera resumed her routine, caring for Sarai, securing what little supplies she could, ensuring that she and her daughter had just enough to get by. But things were not the same. The repairs Ethan had made to her home's heating unit kept the cold at bay better than anything she had been able to afford before. The reinforced power lines meant that, for the first time in years, she did not have to worry about the lights flickering out in the middle of the night. The food he had given her had lasted longer than she had expected, easing the hunger that had once been a constant, gnawing ache in the back of her mind. Everything was a little easier now, and that only made it harder to ignore the fact that he was gone. It was foolish. She knew that. She had survived alone for years before meeting him. She had raised Sarai without help, had endured countless hardships, had learned to navigate a world that took everything from those who could not fight for themselves. She had never needed anyone before. So why, now, did she feel as though something was missing? She buried the thoughts. They were useless, dangerous things, distractions that served no purpose. She had debts to pay, a child to raise, a life to keep from falling apart. Whatever Ethan Voss had left behind was irrelevant. Or at least, that was what she told herself. Until he returned. The return of the ghost. The first sign was the silence. The marketplace was never quiet. It was a place of bartering, shouting, tension, where people haggled over the last scraps of food, where traders argued over prices, where desperation was spoken in hushed voices and shouted demands alike. But today, something had changed. Zalera noticed it the moment she stepped into the trade quarter. Conversations were shorter, sharper. Eyes flickered toward the sky, toward the outskirts of the settlement, toward the landing fields where only one ship was expected today, a ship that had not been seen on Velmara, 7 in weeks. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would not go looking. But her feet carried her forward before her mind could stop them. By the time she reached the outskirts, a small crowd had already gathered, murmuring among themselves, uncertain, wary, curious. They had all seen ships come and go before, but this one was different. The moment Zalera saw the familiar, weathered freighter, her heart stumbled in her chest, and then the ramp lowered. And there he was, Ethan Voss, the human who had walked away, the human who had come back. He descended the ramp with his usual, casual gait, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He looked different, but not in a way she could immediately define, as though he had been through something since she had last seen him, something that had left invisible scars in the way he carried himself. But when his eyes met hers, the corners of his lips twitched upward in something that was not quite a smile. "Hey, Zalera." Her throat felt too tight to speak. She had spent weeks telling herself that his absence did not matter. And now, here he was, standing before her again. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she had intended. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as though the answer was obvious. "I told you. If I ever needed a place to run." Her chest tightened. "And do you?" His gaze flickered, just for a moment, then yeah. She exhaled slowly, studying him, searching his face for answers he wasn't giving. "Who?" Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The bounty's gotten bigger. A lot bigger. Some people aren't willing to let it go." Zalera's fingers curled into fists. "And you thought coming back here was a good idea?" He chuckled. "Not really. But I figured if I was going to die somewhere, I'd rather it be a place where at least one person wouldn't celebrate." She hated that he said it so casually, as if his life was nothing more than a bet placed on a losing hand. She hated that she cared. She turned sharply on her heel, her voice colder than she felt. "Come with me. We're not talking about this here." Ethan didn't argue. He just followed. A future that was never meant to be. They talked in her home, in the same room where he had once repaired the heating unit, where he had left supplies without asking for anything in return. He told her enough to understand that he had spent the past few weeks running, fighting, bleeding, trying to stay ahead of those who wanted him dead. He did not tell her why the bounty had been placed on him in the first place, and she did not press. What mattered was that he was here, and she could not let him die for nothing. She made a decision. "You can't stay here." Ethan sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Not because I want you gone." The words surprised even her, but she did not take them back. "Because Velmara, 7 is not safe for you. Not anymore." He nodded, as though he had already known. "Then what do you suggest?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into the small storage unit near the corner of the room, pulling out a data chip, one she had kept for years, for a moment like this, for a reason she had never expected to find. She handed it to him. "It's a location," she said. "A place far enough from here that they won't find you immediately. You'll have time to prepare, to decide what comes next." Ethan took the chip, studying it. "And what about you?" Her throat tightened. I will be here. His fingers closed around the chip, but his eyes did not leave her. You don't owe me anything anymore, Zalera. She exhaled slowly, feeling something settle deep inside her. I know. And yet, even as he left, even as she watched his ship disappear into the sky again, she knew. She had not seen the last of him, and one day, he would return. Because some debts were not meant to be repaid. They were meant to be kept.